The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents That's So Logical. Hey, I'm back with a video that I've been kind of wanting to do for a while. I don't think this one will be particularly long. It's kind of about a pet peeve, but it's not just a pet peeve. When somebody says, oh, that's so logical, it kind of sticks in my craw a little bit, kind of along the lines of, by that logic, when really what we're talking about is not so much logic or a logic or a type of logic, but we're actually talking about a logical argument, which is better referred to as reasoning. So it'd be better to say by that reasoning. And instead of saying that's so logical, you would say that seems reasonable or that is so reasonable. So I want to go through a little bit about the relationship between logic and truth. And this is the part that goes beyond pet peeve because it seems that people are confused about it a little bit. First off, there are some incredibly good resources on the internet that will teach you the foundations of logical arguments, that will go through logical syllogisms and the difference between validity and soundness. I have a video up in the Foundation series from way before the Atheist Debates project was even a thing. I may go back and kind of tweak and touch up some of those foundational things. This video may touch on part of that as well. But there are great resources out there to teach you logic, to teach you what it is, how to use it, how to spot fallacies, how we know when logical syllogisms are valid in structure. And a valid structure is one where if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. It directly follows. That's not always the case just because somebody put together something that seems reasonable or seems true. That's independent from how we go about logicking, which oddly enough is not a pet peeve to say logicking, even though I'm sure it's a pet peeve for people who appreciate logic even more than I do. But go check out some of those great resources, learn a little bit about fallacies, and do not get yourself stuck in the notion that, oh, this is all egghead philosophy, epistemology stuff, and it's all big words and tap dancing. This is the basics of how we have to go about reasoning. And so I'm going to touch on just a couple of key points here and let you go out and explore the world after that. So as I noted, this isn't just about the words we use. There's a good reason, I think, there's that word again, for saying that instead of that's so logical to say that's so reasonable or that seems reasonable. Because the truth is, when we look at a syllogism, we are in no way assessing the truth of the premises in the argument. The premises are assumed to be true, kind of. There is an issue of whether or not we have access to truth at all, and I'll get to that at the end, but it doesn't matter. This is the beauty of what logic is, that it does not matter whether or not you actually have access to the truth, because it's not about logicking, which I know just irks somebody again, reasoning our way towards a truth. It is about making sure that we are not fallaciously reasoning ourselves away from things that are truthful. So if you look at a syllogism in the classical form, you have two premises and a conclusion. Premise one, premise two, conclusion. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. You have the major and minor premises, and because the premises connect with a single thing, in this case, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, man and men, and that's the connection, is how you get to this direct conclusion that therefore Socrates is mortal. What if Socrates isn't a man? Doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that this argument is valid in structure. And what we're really saying is if you accept premise one and if you accept premise two, then you must accept the conclusion. Otherwise, you are irrational. You have thrown out reason. If you accept these premises and reject the conclusion, we know from the structure that you are now in conflict. And it's a beautiful thing because nobody is saying that the premises need to be true. What's really going on here is saying if you accept A and if you accept B, then you must accept C because we've already demonstrated that A and B lead to C, or P1 and P2 lead to PQ, which is lead to Q, which is another reason why this is phrased in a different way. Rather than a structured syllogism like this, you might just say if P then Q, P therefore Q. And this is, the if is the single most important word in that structure. Because if P is true, we know that Q follows directly from that. If it's raining, then the street will be wet. Yes, it's possible for it to be raining and not hit the street, but if we accept that when it's raining, the street's going to be wet, it would be an irrational position to reject the conclusion that the street is wet. Doesn't matter whether the street's actually wet. None of that matters. This is why we deal with logic in abstractions. It's why we write if P then Q, P therefore Q. That only deals with the structure. The content doesn't matter. So you assess logical arguments, first of all, by their structure to determine whether or not they're valid. And you plug in things that you know. And, Aristotle and his band of merry logicians have already gone through this and analyzed the various syllogistic forms and shown which ones are valid and which ones aren't. The issue of soundness is one that is generally portrayed, including by me, as an argument is sound if in fact the premises are true. Now, this leads to a problem. What if a premise is true and you don't know it, or you don't have any access to know it? Well, then you can't accept the premise. But then you would be in a position where there's a premise that's true that you are not accepting. And you're completely rational to do that. You don't have the evidence to actually say, yes, it is an established fact, or I am convinced that this is true. And so instead, when we look at these syllogisms, it's always about if you accept. And that's where this becomes incredibly useful, because there's an entire argument that is a thing of astonishing beauty that allows us to be better thinkers. And it has nothing to do with demonstrating whether or not a particular premise is true. That argument is traditionally called a reductio ad absurdum, which is reducing to the absurd. And in order to do that, you take a structure that you know is valid, if P then Q, P therefore Q, and you show that the premise that an individual is claiming to accept, the moon is made of green cheese, leads to a conclusion which they reject. It does not matter, and I'm saying this for the context of evaluating this argument, whether or not the premise is true. The point of the reductio ad absurdum is if you accept a premise and reject the conclusion, there's a problem here. Now, it may be that you have an argument that isn't valid in structure, where your premise could be true and the conclusion could be false. So we eliminate that by getting to the structure of the argument. But if we know that a structure is valid, and you put a premise in that you accept and you reject the conclusion, you are now in a state of, as noted previously, being irrational, being unreasonable. And you can do this to show people that things that they accept and say that they accept as true simply can't be true because they accept the conclusion. It's going to be a little confusing here because what you're saying is you've reached a conclusion that is in conflict with something else that you believe. And these two things are necessarily tied together, such that if you believe one, you must believe the other. And now the person that is being responded to with this reductio ad absurdum argument has to do one of two things. Because the structure is valid, there's no objection on that ground. And so they have to decide, do they actually believe this premise that they've included, or do they believe the conclusion that they've reached? Because they cannot believe both. And this gets to a process of where we demonstrate that one idea is supported by a wealth of information. It would be patently absurd to find out that, the moon is actually made of green cheese or whatever else. And the other one is more of an intuition, perhaps something that they didn't look into as much or that is based on flawed evidence. We don't know. And it's entirely possible that neither the premise nor the conclusion is true. When we use a reductio ad absurdum, it is specifically designed to show that if one is being logically consistent, one has to recognize that they are now in conflict, that they are engaged in what is otherwise referred to as cognitive dissonance, where they are holding two mutually exclusive ideas at the same time. This is the beauty of that. The reason that I talked about this video being, oh, that's so logical, is because colloquially speaking, when people talk about logic, there's a reverence for it, despite the fact that I don't think as many people understand it as show reverence for it. It's one of those things that we value, and we don't always necessarily understand why we value it. And even for those who do understand why we value it, that doesn't mean we're always going to do it right. We're going to make mistakes. And it's the reason that syllogisms in their structure and analysis are devoid of content. It's subject predicate, it's P then Q, it's let's remove the content so that we can find out if this argument the structure is correct, and then we'll put terms in and figure that out. At the end of the day though, just because we intuitively accept that something is true, that's independent from whether or not it's actually true, and it's also independent from whether or not we have good reason to be true. And I'm going to finish this off with one of my favorite examples of a monumental mistake that I made during one of my debates. Some of you will already know what it is. So in the infamous debate between myself and Cy ten Bergenkate, he presented exactly one argument for why it is reasonable to believe that God exists. And he bamboozled me, as I've talked about before, because his argument was very simple. Premise 1, it is reasonable to believe that which is true. Premise 2, it is true that God exists. Conclusion, therefore it is reasonable to believe that God exists. Now, structurally, there's nothing wrong with this argument. It's a valid structure. And so now we have to decide either we accept it, we accept both of the premises, and we then accept the conclusion, or we're just going to say we're irrational. So let's be rational. Do we accept both of the premises? Well, Cy did this little bait and switch thing, which worked wonderfully for a while, which was, I don't expect Matt to object to premise 1. Everybody agrees with that. He'll probably accept to premise 2, being, it is true that God exists. And he's right, I did object to that premise. But I didn't need to go that far, because his first premise is wrong. The first premise, the one that in the heat, and in the moment in the debate, I overlooked. Fortunately, a member of the audience did not overlook this and came up during the Q&A to offer this correction. And if you watch the video, you can see me immediately have an aha moment of, wow, how could I have overlooked something so obvious? Because the first premise in his argument is, it is reasonable to believe that which is true. And that just feels right. I mean, he just flatly said, I don't expect Matt to object to this. Everybody agrees with this. It's not the case. The fact that something is true is completely independent from whether or not we have good reason to accept that it's true. It may be the case that there's a diamond the exact size and shape of my head at the precise median line of a particular planet. We've zeroed in on specific coordinates and it's there. It could be true that it's the case. That doesn't mean that I have reason to believe it. It could be, string theory could be true, but that doesn't mean that I have reason to believe it. Everything we've ever learned about the world was something that was true, and yet up until the moment where we had sufficient reason to discover and recognize that it was true, we did not have sufficient reason to discover or recognize it was true, and therefore it wouldn't have been reasonable to believe. If somebody tells me a God exists, even if that is true, that doesn't mean that I have sufficient reason to believe it. This was the massive, well, one of two flaws. I don't think his second premise was correct either. But it was a massive flaw that got to the heart of what it is to engage in logical reasoning, to take a structure, put premises in, and see what conclusion we reach. I made that mistake live on stage. I've corrected it many times, and it's encouraged me to strive to make sure that when we talk about logical arguments, when we talk about reasoning, that we try to do a better job without digging into the heavy philosophical language, and just point out to everyday people that something can be true and you might not have a good reason to believe it. And the terrifying prospect is that something could be false and yet you might have good reason to believe it's true based only on the information you have. There could be additional information available that you don't have access to that would show that it was false. So in much the same way that science doesn't make proclamations about truth, science builds the best models that are the best tentative explanations for the world, logic does not make proclamations about truth or what is. As a matter of fact, logic is a discovery. It's not an invention, a human invention. There are logical methods that we have invented that are better at sussing out reasonable positions. But logic itself is a discovery that this process of reasoning, if we know this, then we can reach reasonable conclusions from it. If we are convinced of this, then we should also be convinced of some other thing. And most importantly, that absent sufficient evidence to accept a premise, an entire argument that could be valid and sound must, by definition, sit there in a state where we cannot attest to its soundness. And so the conclusion is unknown. If we could demonstrate that the premises are true, then the conclusion would necessarily follow from this. But if we can't, then we can't. And so when Sai began with, "It is reasonable to believe that which is true," what he probably should have said that would have been more accurate is, "It might be reasonable to believe that which is true," although that ruins his syllogism. And even more accurate than that would be, "It is reasonable to accept a proposition as true when there's sufficient evidentiary warrant for it," which would have changed the entire nature of the debate, because then he would have to present evidentiary warrant for his second premise, which also didn't happen. Last note here before I go is this question of, do you have access to truth? This gets into issues that I've talked about before related to hard solipsism. Does the reality I experience, is it really the real reality? Do I have, or, can I rely on my senses? If everything comes to me through my senses, then everything is questionable and we can't be absolutely certain about anything. And I agree. I don't see any pathway to absolute certainty about anything. In that same debate, I talked about maximal certainty, which may or may not be co-equal to absolute certainty. I have no way of knowing. But there are things that are derived from logical arguments where I can be as confident as possible about a conclusion because this is the direction the evidence points. And if I'm going to be reasonable, whether I'm talking about science or logic, then my responsibility is to, a la David Hume, proportion my belief to the evidence, or proportion my confidence level to the evidence. And so how confident I am in a particular premise needs to be weighed in, so that even if you get a discrete if P then Q, what's my confidence level in P? And what's my confidence level in Q if we're going to try to show that if P leads to an absurdity? Hopefully that was clear without charts and diagrams, because that's one of the goals. The best thing you can do is go out and hit up one of the many, many resources that will give you the basic grounding. Hey, go to Wikipedia and look up validity versus soundness, where it talks about the logical structure of an argument independent of whether or not the premises are true. But the key thing is that even if we don't have access to truth, even if we have no access to absolute certainty, we still have things that we accept, and we accept for good reasons, to high degrees of confidence. And if we accept them, and they are premises in a valid structure, then we have to accept the conclusion or acknowledge that we are being irrational. And that's it. See you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.